Some flowers spend a few weeks looking beautiful, and years making you regret planting them. One is still sold in garden centers despite being illegal in parts of North America. Another has probably taken over thousands of gardens simply because nobody warned people what would happen after the first season. Number 1. Morning Glory. Let's start with a flower that's sold everywhere as the perfect beginner plant. Morning Glory is on seed racks at every garden center, every hardware store, every supermarket in spring. It's cheap, it's easy, the packet promises fast coverage and cheerful color all summer. A lot of people plant it as their very first climbing flower. And for one season, it delivers exactly what it promised. Here's what nobody puts on the packet. Morning Glory is technically an annual. It completes its life cycle in one season and dies at first frost. So you'd think the whole thing resets in autumn. It doesn't. Before it dies, Morning Glory drops an enormous number of seeds. Those seeds are tough and long-lived in the soil. They'll germinate the following spring, and the spring after that, and several springs after that. In practice, particularly in warmer gardens, Morning Glory rarely behaves like an annual at all. Most gardeners plant it once for a pretty summer screen and then spend years pulling seedlings from the same patch of soil. Every single spring. But that's only half the problem. While it's growing, Morning Glory twines tightly and quickly around anything within reach, including your other plants. By August, you may find it wrapped around perennials, pulling down rose stems, tangled into shrubs in ways that are genuinely difficult to remove without damaging whatever it has attached itself to. It doesn't ask permission. Grown with real discipline on a fence or trellis with nothing nearby, dead-headed religiously before it sets seed, it can be quite lovely. But most people don't buy it with those conditions in mind. They buy it because it's right there next to the checkout for $1.99. If you love the idea of cheerful climbing flowers without years of surprise seedlings, black-eyed Susan vine is a much easier option. Sweet peas are another excellent choice, easier to manage, fragrant, and just as eye-catching. The next flower looks like it couldn't possibly cause that kind of trouble. It's one of the most delicate-looking plants you can grow. But delicate-looking doesn't mean well-behaved. Number 2. Lily of the Valley. Lily of the Valley looks almost impossible to dislike. Tiny white bells, glossy green leaves, that sweet old-fashioned fragrance. It feels more like something from a cottage garden painting than a plant you'd ever regret putting in the ground. People tuck it into shady corners because it looks delicate, polite, and well-behaved. And for the first year, it usually is. That's what catches people out. The first season rarely causes the problem. You get a few flowers, a nice little patch of green, and you think, perfect. Finally, something that actually likes the shade. Then the patch gets wider. By the second or third spring, you're not just seeing it where you planted it. You're finding little spears of Lily of the Valley pushing up under shrubs, between perennials, along the edge of paths, and sometimes in places where you're almost certain you never put it. It spreads underground through rhizomes, and once those roots have threaded through a border, removing it becomes a real job. You don't just lift a clump and move on. You dig. Then you dig again. Then next spring you spot 3 little shoots you missed, looking far too pleased with themselves. There's another thing people don't always realize when they buy it. Lily of the Valley is poisonous. All parts of the plant are toxic if eaten, which matters if you garden with pets, young children, or anyone who might be tempted by those bright red berries later in the season. In the right place, a contained shady bed, away from pets and children, where you actually want a spreading ground cover, it can still be beautiful. But in a mixed border, especially a small one. It often stops being charming and starts becoming the plant you spend every spring trying to negotiate with. If you love that soft woodland look, there are easier ways to get it. Foam flower, epimedium, or dwarf Solomon's seal give you shade-friendly flowers and foliage without quite the same takeover instinct. The next one is different. Nobody would call this plant innocent-looking. In fact, that's exactly why it sells so well. Number 3. Wisteria. In full bloom, wisteria is one of the most beautiful things you can grow. Those long, cascading purple clusters, the fragrance drifting across the garden, it genuinely stops people in their tracks. So it's easy to understand why it sells so well every spring. Garden centers love selling wisteria in bloom. They don't have to live with it afterwards. What the label often doesn't tell you is that if you buy a cheap wisteria, the kind grown from seed or a basic cutting, you might wait 10 years for it to flower. 10 years. Many gardeners have planted wisteria, maintained a massive, fast-growing woody vine for the better part of a decade, and seen almost nothing in return. And in the meantime, the vine doesn't sit quietly. Asian wisteria, which is most of what gets sold, can put on 10 or 15 feet of new growth in a single season. Left unpruned, it will pull guttering away from roof lines, lift roof tiles, work its way into masonry gaps, and eventually try to take apart wooden fences as if they weren't there. It needs cutting back hard twice a year, once in winter, once in midsummer. Every year, for the rest of your life or the plant's life, whichever comes first. That's usually where the trouble starts. People think they're buying a romantic flowering vine. What they're really buying is a permanent pruning job with a spectacular spring bonus. If you have a large, purpose-built masonry wall or a seriously robust pergola, and you're genuinely willing to commit to that pruning schedule, wisteria can be extraordinary. But that's a specific set of conditions, and most garden situations don't meet them. Fortunately, you don't have to give up on the look altogether. American wisteria, or the cultivar. Blue Moon are far less aggressive, bloom much earlier in their lives, and won't try to dismantle your house. Number 4. English ivy. English ivy has spent decades with a reputation for being responsible. Neat, evergreen, good in shade, ideal for covering banks, filling difficult corners, softening walls. All of that is true, at least at the start. What most people discover too late is what happens when ivy reaches a tree. Ivy climbs by pressing tiny rootlets directly into bark. As it gets higher and heavier, it begins shading out the tree's own canopy. In a storm, the added weight becomes a genuine structural risk. It does not kill trees quickly. It does it slowly, over several years, which means by the time you notice the problem, you have mature ivy well up into the canopy and a much harder job on your hands. If you have ever seen a tree that looks more like a green pillar than a tree, that is often what is happening. The ivy has stopped being a ground cover and started becoming the main event. There is also what happens beyond your garden. In large parts of the United States, particularly the Pacific Northwest, Southeast, and Mid-Atlantic states, English ivy is classified as an invasive species. It spreads easily into woodland areas and crowds out native plants on the forest floor. If you live in those regions, planting it is not just a garden decision, it is an ecological one. On walls, it is worth knowing that the rootlets do not simply cling to the surface. Over time, they can work into mortar, particularly in older homes with softer lime mortar, and create moisture problems that are expensive to fix. On solid modern masonry, it is generally less of an issue. On a Victorian terrace, less so. For shade ground cover, sweet woodruff or pachysandra, are much easier to live with. And if you want something for a wall, climbing hydrangea is slower to establish, but far less damaging and genuinely beautiful once it gets going. The next one isn't invasive in the same way. It's more of a slow accumulation, one you might be living with right now without realizing there's a much better alternative. Number 5, the common orange daylily. This isn't about daylilies in general. Modern hybrid daylilies are terrific garden plants, good foliage, long bloom seasons, very little maintenance. This is specifically about the plain orange daylily, the one growing in the ditch at the end of the road, the one that came with the house, the one your neighbor divided and gave you a bucket of because they had more than they knew what to do with. That detail, the bucket, the ditch, the fact they are giving it away by the barrow load, is worth paying attention to. The common orange daylily spreads through fleshy underground tubers, and it spreads persistently. One clump becomes several. Several become a solid mass that's genuinely difficult to remove, because any piece of root you leave in the soil, and you will leave some, will produce a new plant. People dig it out, feel satisfied, and find new shoots the following spring, and the one after that. For all that persistence, it offers very little variety in return. 3 weeks of orange flowers in early summer, then a large clump of coarse foliage that sits in the border looking tired until frost. No repeat flowering, no seasonal interest. It just takes up space. A lot of people inherit it with an older garden and quietly manage it for years without ever asking whether it is actually worth keeping. That's where this plant gets away with it. It doesn't arrive as a decision. It arrives as part of the furniture. Any modern named hybrid daylily gives you better flowers, longer bloom, more interesting foliage choices, and without the same spreading problem. Stella d'Oro is still one of the most reliable compact repeat bloomers available. Number 6, purple leucostrife. This next one is genuinely serious. It has been pulled from sale in many places, and there is a real reason for that. Purple leucostrife is a striking plant. Tall stems, vivid magenta purple flowers in late summer. The kind of thing you might see growing near a pond or waterway and think would look perfect at the back of a border. And for a long time it was widely sold in garden centers across North America, marketed as a low-maintenance, wildlife-friendly perennial. Most people do not realize how much damage one beautiful plant can do when it gets into the wrong place. A single purple loosestrife plant can produce 2 to 3 million seeds in a year. They travel on wind, water, and anything that passes nearby, and they germinate readily. Once leucostrife gets into a wetland or marsh, and it does not stay politely in gardens, it forms dense, single-species stands that choke out native vegetation and eliminate the habitat that birds, fish, and insects depend on. It is not aggressive in the way a spreading garden plant is aggressive. It is aggressive in a way that alters ecosystems. That is why it is now illegal to sell, plant, or transport in many U.S. states and Canadian provinces. If you are in those regions and you see it being sold somewhere, it is worth double-checking what you are actually looking at. It is occasionally mislabeled, and it does still spread from older gardens where it was planted before restrictions came into effect. In the UK, it is a European native and less of an ecological concern, though it is still a very dominant plant near water that needs careful management. For upright purple flower spikes in a border, salvia gives you the look without the invasive problems. For waterside planting, swamp milkweed or native irises are both genuinely lovely and actively beneficial to local wildlife. Number 7. Hybrid tea roses. This last one is different from everything else on this list. It won't take over your garden. It won't spread into the lawn, or climb through your guttering, or seed itself across the countryside. In fact, the issue with hybrid tea roses is almost the opposite. They're fragile, demanding, and deeply susceptible to disease. But given how widely they're sold and how much time and money people invest in them, they might cause more collective frustration than anything else here. Hybrid teas are what most people picture when they think of a rose. The long-stemmed, high-centered flowers you see in florists and on greeting cards. They come in every color, and when they're in full bloom, they're genuinely beautiful. And that's exactly why people buy them. You're standing in the garden center looking at one perfect flower, and nobody is talking about what it takes to keep the plant looking even halfway decent by August. Hybrid teas are highly susceptible to black spot, rust, and powdery mildew, fungal diseases that can strip the plant of its leaves through summer if you don't spray preventively, often every 10 to 14 days throughout the growing season. They need deadheading, regular feeding, careful autumn pruning, and in colder climates, winter protection. All of that for a plant that, in many cases, has been bred for flower shape at the expense of fragrance. So you do all that work and discover the thing barely smells like a rose at all. That's the part that really disappoints people. They think they're buying roses. What they often end up buying is a maintenance schedule with flowers attached. Rose breeders have known for decades that disease resistance and scent are achievable. The issue is that hybrid teas were selected for florist-quality flowers first, and everything else came second. What's changed is that there are now far better alternatives that didn't exist a generation ago. English roses from David Austin combine genuine fragrance and beautiful flower forms with much stronger disease resistance. The Knockout series and similar modern shrub roses are practically bulletproof by comparison to a hybrid tea. Many gardeners who make that switch say the same thing. They can't believe they spent so long fighting a plant when better options were right there. For fragrance and elegance, David Austin roses are worth every penny. For a virtually maintenance-free garden rose, knockout varieties are hard to beat. Conclusion. What all of these plants have in common isn't that they're bad. It's that they're often sold in situations where they don't fit, in pots at the garden center in spring, looking their absolute best, with very little explanation of what they're like to live with. That's the part gardeners learn over time. A plant isn't just a flower on the day you buy it. It's the pruning, the seedlings, the runners, the disease, the space it takes up, and the time it asks from you every year after. The gardeners who end up with the most enjoyable gardens aren't usually the ones who spend the most or try the most things. They're the ones who've learned, sometimes the hard way, to ask a simple question before anything goes in the ground. Not just, do I love this, but does this actually belong here? Because the best gardens usually aren't filled with the most beautiful plants. They're filled with the right plants, ones that suit your climate, your space, and the amount of time you actually want to spend maintaining them. If you want to know what actually does belong in a low-maintenance garden, plants that look after themselves, come back reliably, and give you more than they ask for, this video covers exactly that. Worth a look before your next trip to the garden center.